The sky over Europe was already burning. At 20,000 feet, the cold air ripped past the canopy as the formation pushed deeper into enemy territory. Below, black flak bursts clawed upward like dark flowers exploding in slow motion. The radio crackled with tension. Bandits, 10 o'clock high. Then the sky erupted. Sleek enemy fighters tore through the clouds, diving straight into the bomber formation. Machine guns thundered. Tracer fire carved glowing lines through the thin air. Engines screamed. Within seconds, what had been a tight, disciplined formation became a storm of twisting metal and fire. One American pilot pulled hard on the stick, trying to break away from a pursuing fighter closing in fast behind him. His aircraft shuddered. Bullets punched through the wings. The cockpit filled with the smell of burning oil and cordite. Warning lights flickered across the instrument panel. Another voice screamed over the radio, then suddenly went silent. Below him, a bomber spiraled downward trailing smoke. Above him, another fighter exploded into flame. For 3 endless minutes, the sky turned into pure chaos, a swirling battlefield of speed, fear, and survival measured in seconds. And when the smoke finally cleared, only one pilot was still flying. His aircraft was barely holding together. His ammunition nearly gone. And the enemy was still hunting him. What happened during those 3 minutes of sky hell would become one of the most unbelievable survival stories of the air war. Because this pilot didn't just escape. He fought his way out of the storm. And the aircraft he flew that day would prove why it became one of the most feared machines in the skies of World War II. The altimeter needle trembled just above 21,000 feet. Up here, the world was silent, except inside the cockpit. Engines roared like thunder trapped in metal. The bomber's 4 propellers clawed through thin air, each vibration shaking through the pilot's seat and into his bones. Below the formation, the earth was hidden beneath a gray blanket of clouds. Somewhere down there were factories, rail yards, and airfields feeding the enemy war machine. But the real danger wasn't below. It was coming from above. The first warning came as a sharp burst of static in the radio headset. Bandits, high, coming fast. Heads turned instantly. Tiny black dots were dropping out of the sun. Within seconds, those dots grew into the unmistakable shapes of German fighters, sleek wings, radial engines, and the deadly silhouette every Allied airman had learned to fear. The Focke-Wulf Fw 190. They dove like hawks. The first attack shattered the calm in an instant. Cannon shells exploded against the formation. Tracers streaked across the sky in blazing red arcs. A bomber at the edge of the formation suddenly lurched as its wing erupted in flame. Taking hits. Taking hits. Gunners swung their turrets wildly, trying to track the fighters as they flashed past at terrifying speed. The sky became a spinning maze of aircraft. Smoke trails. Explosions. And screaming engines. Then one bomber drifted slightly out of position. Just a few hundred yards from the safety of the formation. But in aerial combat, that distance might as well have been miles. The German fighters saw it immediately. 2 of them broke away. Then another. Within seconds, the isolated aircraft became their target. The pilot glanced at his gauges. One engine temperature was rising dangerously. The aircraft had already taken damage. He knew exactly what was about to happen. His bomber was now alone. Behind him, the fighters began their attack run. The pilot tightened his grip on the control yoke as the first tracer rounds flashed past the cockpit glass. 3 minutes later, only one pilot would still be flying. By the middle years of World War II, the air war over Europe had become a brutal test of engineering, skill, and endurance. Bombers from the United States Army Air Forces were flying deeper into Nazi-occupied Europe than ever before. Their targets were factories, rail yards, oil depots, anything that kept the German war machine alive. But these missions came at a terrible cost. The heavy bombers, particularly the legendary Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, were powerful machines. Bristling with machine guns and capable of absorbing shocking damage, they were designed to survive enemy fire. Yet they had one weakness: speed. German fighters could climb faster and strike with devastating precision. Among the most dangerous of these interceptors was the Focke-Wulf Fw 190, a rugged and deadly aircraft introduced by Germany in 1941. Fast, heavily armed, and terrifyingly agile at combat altitudes, it quickly became one of the most feared opponents in the European skies. The clash between bombers and fighters created some of the most violent aerial battles of the entire war. And sometimes those battles came down to moments measured in seconds. The mission. One such moment began during a bombing mission over Germany in 1943. Dozens of B-17 Flying Fortresses thundered through the thin air in tight combat formation. Each bomber depended on the others for protection. Their overlapping machine guns created a deadly defensive wall. But even that wasn't always enough. German radar stations had already detected the incoming formation. Within minutes, interceptor squadrons were scrambling to meet them. Soon, dark specks appeared on the horizon. Enemy fighters. They climbed rapidly toward the bombers, using the sun and cloud cover to hide their approach. Then they attacked. The first strike. The Fw-190s came in fast and aggressive. They dove through the formation at nearly 400 miles per hour, cannons blazing. Their heavy 20mm autocannons could tear through bomber armor like paper. One bomber lost an engine instantly. Another erupted in flame. The sky filled with fragments of aluminum and smoke. But the bomber gunners fought back with ferocity. .50 caliber machine guns roared from every direction. Tracer rounds streaked outward, turning the formation into a glowing fortress of fire. Fighters flashed past the bombers so quickly that some attacks lasted only seconds. Yet each pass could destroy an aircraft. The break in the formation. During the chaos of one attack, a single bomber drifted out of formation. It had already taken hits. One engine was failing. The aircraft struggled to maintain altitude. And that was exactly what the German fighters were waiting for. Within moments, several Fw-190s peeled away from the main attack and turned toward the isolated bomber. Predators circling wounded prey. Inside the bomber, the crew could see them approaching. The pilot tightened his grip on the controls. The next 3 minutes would decide everything. Skyhell. The first fighter attacked from above. Cannon shells ripped through the bomber's right wing. Fuel sprayed into the air like mist. The gunners opened fire. One of them shouted that he'd hit the attacker. The fighter pulled away trailing smoke, but another was already diving in. The bomber shook violently as rounds slammed into the fuselage. Glass shattered. Hydraulic lines burst. One gun position went silent. Still the bomber stayed in the air. The pilot forced the damaged aircraft into a shallow dive, trying to gain speed. The remaining engines roared as he pushed them to their limits. But the fighters kept coming. One streaked past the cockpit so close the crew could see the pilot's helmet through the canopy. Then something unexpected happened. A fighter lined up for another attack. But instead of firing, he slowed. He flew alongside the shattered bomber for a few seconds, close enough to see the wounded crew inside. Then he rolled away and disappeared into the clouds. The enemy perspective. German fighter pilots knew the B-17 Flying Fortress well. They had seen bombers explode in midair. They had watched others stagger home riddled with hundreds of bullet holes. But sometimes even the enemy recognized courage when they saw it. That moment of hesitation may have saved the bomber crew. Because once the fighters broke off their attack, the damaged aircraft had a chance to escape. The long flight home. The bomber limped across the sky for hours. One engine completely dead. Another barely functioning. Large sections of the fuselage torn open. Yet the aircraft refused to fall. This was exactly what the Flying Fortress had been built for. Durability, survivability, and the determination of the crews who flew them. When the battered bomber finally crossed back over friendly territory, ground crews stared in disbelief. Large holes ripped through the wings. The tail nearly destroyed. But it had survived. And so had most of the crew. All because they endured 3 minutes of absolute sky hell. Strategic impact. Stories like this became legendary among Allied air crews. They demonstrated why long-range bomber operations were so dangerous, and why fighter escorts later became critical to protecting them. Aircraft like the North American P-51 Mustang would eventually escort bombers all the way to Germany and back, dramatically reducing losses. But during the early years of the air war, bomber crews often faced the enemy alone, and survival depended on two things: the strength of their aircraft, and the courage of the men inside it. The bomber under attack was part of a formation built around the legendary Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, one of the most heavily defended bombers of the war. Armed with up to 13.50 caliber machine guns, the aircraft was designed to fight its way through enemy defenses. But even the Flying Fortress had limits. When German interceptors like the Focke-Wulf Fw-190 attacked in coordinated waves, they could overwhelm even the strongest bomber formation. The Fw-190 had several critical advantages. Its radial engine gave it tremendous durability during combat dives. Its heavy armament, typically 4 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns, allowed it to destroy bombers with only a few direct hits. And perhaps most importantly, it was fast. German pilots often attacked from above and behind, diving through the bomber formation at incredible speed before climbing away to strike again. For the isolated bomber now fighting for survival, that tactic created a deadly cycle. Break away. Climb. Attack again. Each pass lasted only seconds, but each one could destroy the aircraft. Inside the battered bomber, the crew understood the brutal truth. If the fighters kept attacking, those 3 minutes might be the last minutes of their lives. When historians look back at the air war of World War II, they often measure it in numbers. Thousands of bombers. Millions of tons of bombs dropped. Entire cities reshaped by strategic bombing. But those numbers can hide the reality of what happened in the sky. Because every mission was carried out by crews who knew the odds were never in their favor. The B-17 Flying Fortress became one of the defining aircraft of that struggle. It was not the fastest bomber of the war. It wasn't the newest, and it certainly wasn't invincible. Yet it possessed something that few aircraft could match, an extraordinary ability to survive. Stories from the war are filled with accounts of B-17s returning home with entire sections of their fuselage missing, engines destroyed, and wings torn apart. Some landed with only 2 functioning engines. Others landed with only 1. Yet again and again these aircraft managed to bring their crews back alive. That resilience transformed the Flying Fortress into a symbol of endurance for the Allied air forces. But the true legacy of the aircraft wasn't just the machine itself. It was the men who flew inside it. The pilots who held damaged bombers steady while flak exploded around them. The navigators who guided crippled aircraft across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. The gunners who defended their formation against fighters diving out of the sun. And the crews who continued flying missions even after watching friends and squadron mates disappear into the clouds below. The bombing campaign over Europe became one of the most decisive strategic efforts of the war. Factories were destroyed. Fuel supplies were cut. German production struggled under the constant pressure of Allied air power. But that victory came with enormous sacrifice. Aircrews often referred to bomber missions as a tour of hell at 25,000 feet. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. Oxygen masks were required just to breathe, and enemy fighters could appear at any moment. In that environment, even a few seconds of combat could determine the fate of an entire crew. Which is why moments like those 3 minutes in the sky became unforgettable. 3 minutes when everything seemed lost. 3 minutes when enemy fighters circled like wolves. 3 minutes when survival depended on skill, luck, and sheer determination. When the smoke cleared, only 1 aircraft remained in the sky. Badly damaged, barely flying, but still alive. And that moment captured something essential about the air war of World War II. Not just the machines, not just the strategy, but the resilience of the people who faced unimaginable danger thousands of feet above the earth. Because in the end, the story of the Flying Fortress is not simply about a bomber that could endure impossible damage. It is about the men who climbed into those aircraft knowing they might never return. And yet they flew anyway. Through flak bursts, through fighter attacks, through the burning chaos of the sky, until the mission was complete, and the engines finally carried them home. Because in the skies of World War II, survival was never guaranteed. Sometimes it came down to just 3 minutes of sky hell. And 1 pilot who refused to fall. Long after the war ended, veterans of the air campaign over Europe would struggle to describe what those missions truly felt like. It was not just combat. It was endurance. Flying at 25,000 feet meant temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. Oxygen masks were required simply to stay conscious. And every mission meant flying directly into the heart of enemy defenses. Flak batteries fired thousands of shells into the sky. Enemy fighters waited beyond the target area. And mechanical failures could turn a routine mission into a fight for survival. Yet despite all of that, the crews kept flying. Aircraft like the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress became legends not because they were perfect machines, but because they were built to endure punishment that seemed impossible. Photographs taken after the war show bombers returning with wings shredded by cannon fire, tails nearly torn off, and entire sections of fuselage missing. And yet those aircraft still landed, still brought their crews home. But survival in the air war was never guaranteed. For every bomber that limped back to base, another vanished into the clouds. That is why stories like the 3 minutes of sky hell remain so powerful today. Because they reveal the fragile line between survival and disaster. 3 minutes. That was all it took for a calm formation flight to become a desperate battle for life. 3 minutes of cannon fire tearing through aluminum. 3 minutes of pilots fighting damaged aircraft through clouds of smoke and flame. 3 minutes when the sky itself seemed to turn against them. And when the battle finally ended, only 1 aircraft remained in the air. Damaged, outnumbered, but still flying. It is a reminder that the air war of World War II was not just a clash of machines. It was a test of human courage thousands of feet above the earth, where sometimes victory, and sometimes survival, came down to just 3 minutes in the sky.